Imagine a chain of islands stretching across the edge of the Pacific Ocean, where mountains rise steeply from the sea and rivers carve their way down into fertile plains. This is the land we now call Japan. But long before there was any concept of a nation or a kingdom, it was simply a scattering of volcanic islands covered in dense forests, surrounded by endless waves. For thousands of years, people here lived close to nature, hunting in the forests, fishing in the rivers and the sea, and gathering nuts and fruits from the trees. Their lives followed the rhythm of the seasons, the rise and fall of the tides, and the constant presence of the mountains and the ocean. These first people of Japan, whom we call the Jomon, left behind something remarkable: pottery unlike anything else in the world at the time. Their clay vessels, decorated with swirling patterns and ropes pressed into wet clay, are among the oldest pottery ever discovered. They remind us that even in such ancient times, there was already a sense of creativity, of beauty, and of ritual in everyday life. When you look at a Jomon pot, you can imagine a small village gathered around a fire, the crackling of wood, the smell of cooked fish, the conversations carried by voices that have long since vanished, but whose echoes still reach us through these artifacts. The Jomon were not kings or emperors. They did not build great cities or wage large wars. Instead, they built communities small and spread out, living in harmony with the natural world around them. They hunted deer and boar with stone-tipped arrows. They fished with bone hooks, and they crafted tools with skill passed down through countless generations. Their lives might seem simple to us now, but they were also deeply spiritual. Archaeologists have found clay figurines with large eyes and strange shapes, often broken on purpose. These may have been offerings, symbols of prayer or protection, perhaps connected to life, fertility, or the mysteries of death. We cannot know for certain what these figures meant, but their presence tells us that even in the earliest days of Japan, people looked beyond survival and sought meaning in the unseen world. As centuries passed, the land itself shaped the people who lived on it. Japan is mountainous, with very little flat land, and this geography made travel difficult. Communities were often isolated, separated by ridges and forests, but they were also protected by the sea. The islands of Japan were both a shield and a barrier, keeping out many of the conflicts of the Asian mainland, while also limiting exchange of ideas. Still, the ocean was not a wall but a pathway, and over time new influences began to arrive. Around 300 BCE, a new wave of people and technologies entered Japan from the continent, bringing with them wet rice agriculture, bronze, and iron. This would slowly transform the way people lived. But before that change fully unfolded, the Jomon world had already lasted for thousands upon thousands of years, making it one of the most enduring prehistoric cultures on Earth. To step back, before agriculture, before kingdoms, let us linger for a moment in the world of the Jomon. Imagine the forest alive with cicadas in summer, heavy snows blanketing the northern islands in winter, the people adjusting their lives with each season. Their homes were simple pick dwellings dug into the earth, warm in the cold months and cool in the summer heat. They wove fibres into baskets, crafted ornaments from shells, and carved tools from bone and stone. They understood the rhythms of the land, the migration of animals, the cycles of plants. In a way, they lived in balance with their environment in a manner that feels distant to us now, but perhaps also enviable. The story of Japan begins not with emperors or samurai, but with these quiet lives. It is a reminder that history is not only written by those who ruled, but also by those who simply lived. Every fragment of pottery, every arrowhead, every figurine unearthed from the soil is a voice from that time, telling us of endurance, adaptation, and imagination. The people of the Jomon period are often described as prehistoric, but their history was rich in its own way, even if it was not recorded with ink and paper. Their legacy is etched in clay and stone, in the earth itself. As the ages turned, this world would give way to new ways of living. Rice paddies would spread across the valleys, metal tools would replace stone, and clans would rise to dominance. Eventually, these changes would lead to kingdoms, to wars, and to the long arc of history that most people associate with Japan. But everything began here, in the forests and along the coasts, with people who looked at the land and the sea around them, and built lives that lasted for millennia. This is the introduction to the story of Japan. Not a story of sudden empires, but of slow beginnings, of human hands shaping clay, of communities finding meaning in the natural world, and of a people whose voices still reach us across time. When we talk about the beginnings of what would later become the Japan we recognize today, we are stepping into a time of transition. For thousands of years, the Jomon people had lived on these islands, hunting, fishing, gathering, and making pottery that still amazes us with its intricate rope-like designs. Their world was old and enduring, and it might have lasted forever, had it not been for the slow arrival of new ideas, new technologies, and new people from across the sea. Around 300 BCE, something began to change. A different way of living slowly took root, and the society that emerged from it would transform Japan forever. This was the beginning of the Yayoi period. The first and most important change was rice. Not just any rice, but wet rice cultivation, the kind that grows in carefully flooded fields called paddies. Imagine the landscape shifting, valleys carved into squares of water, with people bending in rows to plant seedlings by hand. For the first time, the people of these islands could produce food on a scale that hunting and gathering could never match. Rice meant stability. Rice meant more mouths could be fed. Rice meant villages could grow larger, and families could stay in one place without constantly moving to follow the seasons. Along with rice came metal. Bronze and iron tools began appearing, brought from the Asian mainland through trade and migration. Where once there had been only stone and bone, now there were sharper blades, sturdier axes, and new weapons. With metal came more efficient farming, which in turn meant greater harvests. Bronze bells, called dotaku, were cast and decorated with intricate designs, often showing animals or farming scenes. These bells were not used for war or for music in the way we might expect, but for ritual. They were buried in the ground, hidden in sacred places, as offerings to ensure good harvests or to communicate with the unseen. Society too began to change. The small, scattered villages of the Jomon gave way to larger, more organized communities. Stilt houses with thatched roofs rose above the earth, built to store rice safely from pests and floods. The storage of food meant that wealth could now be measured, and with wealth came inequality. Some people began to rise above others. Leaders emerged, chiefs who controlled land, harvests, and the labor of their people. These were the first steps towards social hierarchy in Japan. Archaeology tells us that burials from this time also reflect the new differences in status. Some graves contained little more than simple pots or tools, while others held bronze mirrors, fine weapons, and ornaments that must have belonged to the powerful. These chiefs, buried with symbols of prestige, remind us that this was no longer the equal world of hunters and gatherers. Authority had begun to crystallize, and the seeds of political power were being planted. But not everything was rigid or somber. Life in Yayoi villages would have been filled with the rhythms of the seasons. Spring meant planting, summer the tending of fields, autumn the harvest, and winter the storing and sharing of rice. Families cooked meals over open fires, wove fibers into cloth, and shaped clay into smoother, simpler pottery than the elaborate Jomon designs. Children ran through the fields, and elders passed down stories of spirits and ancestors. The Yayoi may have lived 2,000 years ago, but their lives carried the same mixture of work, joy, and worry that we can still recognize today. As rice cultivation spread, so too did contact with the outside world. Across the narrow seas that separated Japan from Korea and China, ships carried more than goods. They carried ideas. Ironworking techniques, new methods of farming, and even concepts of governance crossed the water. Japan was still isolated in many ways, but it was no longer a world entirely its own. Through these contacts, the Yayoi people stepped gradually into the broader current of East Asian history. Yet the islands always remained distinct. The geography of Japan, Rugged mountains, deep forests, and long coasts shaped how these new influences were absorbed. Rice paddies could only be carved into certain valleys, and villages often grew where nature allowed them. Communities were tied to the land in an intimate way, with their lives bounded by the terrain that surrounded them. The sea, at once a barrier and a bridge, ensured that change came slowly, on Japan's own terms. We can picture a Yayoi village at dusk, the light fading, smoke rising from hearths, villagers returning from the fields with bundles of rice plants. A bronze bell hidden beneath the soil in a nearby grove glints faintly in the firelight. Children sit near their parents, listening to the crackle of the fire, while elders speak of the spirits that guard the harvest. Somewhere, a chief counts the jars of rice stored safely in raised granaries, his authority built on the grain that sustains them all. This was no longer the timeless world of the Jomon. This was something new, a society on the path toward kingdoms, wars, and empires. The shift was not sudden. For generations, Jomon and Yayoi ways coexisted, overlapped and blended. In some regions, people clung to the old traditions of hunting and gathering, while in others, rice fields spread quickly. The process was gradual, a transformation that unfolded over centuries rather than years. But by the 1st century CE, the change was undeniable. The Yayoi culture had spread across much of Japan, reshaping it from the inside out.